over to you, Dr. Subramanian.
Great. Well, thanks, Sarah, for all you do. We appreciate having the platform here with PMD Alliance and, continuing to stay, unfortunately, physically distanced, but, trying to socially connect through this medium, which has become kind of, our special place to connect. And I think a lot of patients are looking forward to this as well. And so excited to, kind of enter the holiday season, hopefully with some positivity, some hope, some great speakers we have in the next few weeks. And Malú Tansey has become a friend and a colleague and just an amazing, I think, woman in medicine. She really embodies a lot of what I hope to be someday, which is, a thought leader, really trying to connect, science and basic science to what matters to patients. And she does this, time and time again with, her role at the World Parkinson Congress and some of the things that she does with, patient support groups in the community working. I think she was heavily recruited and one of Mike Okun's prize possessions over there. It was not hard for him to find a short list of great people to give talks through the series. And I know that Malú came highly recommended from him. And so I'm just really excited to have you, Malú. And also she's a proud Latina woman in medicine. So I think, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey that way too, and some inspiration to help the folks out there in the world and the global community understand how, our different voices, our different, sort of points of view really make a difference for this type of disease, and maybe anything you can add, in terms of the advocacy work that you've been doing, I think, in that space to help, really bring everyone to the table and represent them. So welcome, Malú. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey. You are, I know, an American physiologist. You have a Wikipedia page, so that's cool. I hope to have a Wikipedia page someday. You're a neuroscientist and a director of the Center for Translational Research in Neurodegenerative Disease at the University of Florida, which is a really amazing title. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about the journey to get there and how the work around Parkinson's disease, which I know really inspires you, sort of helps you come to your lab, every day and inspire the people that you work with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Indu, and Sarah and Becky for getting us all set up. The audiovisual people never get enough kudos, and they're really the ones that make all the magic happen behind the scenes. So thank you for that. And thank you everybody else for joining in and listening. I think Indu's right. We've all become closer, even though we're apart in all the corners of the world. Indeed, I'm a Mexican-American born in the United States on the border, grew up on the border. And I think my love of science started in high school. I started going to science fairs, and my biology teacher really encouraged us to think big and to value science and, scientific facts. And so I started doing a lot of science fairs and ended up going to like a science camp, I guess, at UC Davis, and very quickly fell in love with it. And so I ended up going to college at Stanford and getting a biology degree at Stanford. And then I decided, I was going to be pre-med, but, things happen, and I applied to, I guess, there's 6 medical schools in Texas, and I had met a guy at Stanford who also applied to 6 medical schools in Texas, and I got into 5 and he got into 1, and there was no overlap. And he had already applied to the schools in California and did not get in the first round. And so I said, you know what, let's just go to Texas, and I'll work for a year as a technician, and then I'll reapply. And during that 1 year, we went to UT Southwestern in Dallas. During that 1 year, I absolutely fell in love with research. And I thought, I'm not going to medical school. I'm getting a PhD. I'm going to do research. And I have never looked back. So I applied to graduate school instead. So I got a PhD in physiology from UT Southwestern. And really fell in love with research, the how, the why, And interestingly enough, here I am working with patients, but not taking care of patients, which is a very different thing. I think my contribution to clinical practice is more in how we understand the disease, how it comes about, and, you know, maybe the impact is not direct, but it's more at the beginning stages of understanding a disease and then trying to figure out how we can develop better therapies. So that's, you know, what I hope to be able to do. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we do it. After that, we moved to St. Louis. Oh, that's my dog, Polly. Polly, come here. We moved to St. Louis, and that was an amazing time. That's where I fell in love with the brain. And my interest in Parkinson's came about then because we were working with the dopamine neurons that are lost in Parkinson's. And that's when I was working in a lab that discovered nurturin. And nurturin, as you know, was that factor that was given to Parkinson's patients in a gene therapy trial by Serogene. And so nurturin was discovered by my colleagues and I, and we worked on the nurturin signal pathway in Gene Johnson's lab and Jeff Milbrand's lab at WashU. And so when the first patients got the nurturin gene therapy, I got a call, and I still get really emotional because it was really important. So that was exciting. After that, I decided I was going to go to biotech to learn how we could make faster and better drugs. So I went to biotech and I learned about inflammation and what inflammation does to the body. So you're going to learn about that today. And then I decided that I really missed being my own boss, and I really missed training the students and training the people that were going to be tomorrow's scientists. So I went back to academia and I became a professor at UT Southwestern in 2002, and I started my own lab. And so the place that wouldn't let me into medical school then hired me as a professor. And I started my lab there. And so I was there for about 6 years, and then Emory recruited me away. And it was a fantastic time. I became a tenured professor at UT Southwestern. Did a lot of work at Emory on inflammation. And that's where I think I became kind of a challenged and decided that I wanted to build something bigger. And then Michael Okun at the University of Florida recruited me and really gave me a leadership position at UF. And so after 10 years at Emory, I moved to the University of Florida last year, and here I am. And so I used both my interest in the brain and my interest in inflammation to try to understand why inflammation is either good or bad for your body. And so this is what my slides are going to tell you about, how
Perfect.
we understand what your immune system does when you're young and what your immune system does as you get older, and why we think that things that are in your gut microbiome are part of your immune system, and how they could potentially be modified to help you have a healthier brain, and how we think that the gut microbiome may be contributing to that inflammation that could potentially, and I say potentially, explain the synuclein aggregation that may start in the gut for Parkinson's, right? So that's a controversial idea about where Parkinson's starts. Does it start in the gut? Does it go from the gut to the brain? So you're going to hear about that. And that is a question that we and others are exploring.
That's amazing.
That's what it is. So are we ready?
Thank you for your raw emotion. I think it's really beautiful. I know I get kind of.
I know. I get really moved, as you can see.
It just speaks to your passion. So, and I think this is such an important cause. So I think, we're all very passionate about it. But so why don't I, without further ado, let you teach us a little bit about your, sort of slide deck, and then we can take some questions.
Yeah, happy to answer questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details. Let me see, share screen, and we'll share this. I won't spend too much time on the details because I want to keep it sort of high level so that you can ask me questions. And so some of these slides, I think some of these slides I use for scientific presentations, and so they have some details that you probably don't need to worry about. So I'm going to hit the highlights and tell you what is important about them. These are just some disclosures that I, need to tell you about in terms of some industry collaborations and advisory boards that I sit on, and editorial boards and things like that. Okay, so this slide just basically makes the point that don't think of your brain as something that's isolated from the rest of your body, right? We used to think that the brain was completely immune privileged and was not seeing anything that was going on in your body. And so whatever you did out here had nothing to do with your brain. And so that's completely wrong. In fact, in order to keep your body healthy, your brain regulates the rest of it, right? And whatever's happening to your liver or your gut, your brain knows about, and whatever's happening to those organs are affecting your brain. And so this schematic basically tells you that there's this communication that's two ways between your brain and your immune system, and that there's communication between cells like neurons and tissues that make up things like your brain, and the circulatory system, the gut, the heart, everything that's outside your brain. And it's a two-way communication, right? And this communication is super important all the time, when you're young, when you're old, and when something goes wrong, there's crosstalk, and then there's miscommunication if it's not good. Now, what happens is, because of the fact that we're social human beings, and we go around in groups, right? There's been evolutionary pressure for us to develop genes that give us strong immune responses. Why? Because of infectious disease, because of COVID, because there are viruses that get passed around when we get together in groups. When we get together in groups, you pass viruses between each other. And to avoid that, we have evolutionary pressure to develop an immune response that will kill that virus, right? Just like now. That's why they say, don't go in groups, stay away from each other, right? That's what keeps the virus from going from one person to the other. So that evolutionary pressure to have a strong immune response is important so that you can live to pass on your genes, right? So that is good if you're only going to live to 25 or 30. But now we have lived too long, right? And so now we have outlived what we were intended to live, right? And so our lifespan has gone beyond, a certain amount of years. And so now this increased longevity has done two things to our bodies. One of the things that's happened is that the immune system is aging, right? And it's called inflammaging or inflammaging. And what happens is that you get this overproduction of inflammatory factors, and the immune cells are getting older, right? So there's this wear and tear, and nobody's thinking about that, right? Everybody's like, oh, my skin's getting older, the heart's getting older, this is getting older, but the immune system is getting older too. And when the immune system starts getting old, it starts getting inflamed. And that's one of the things that happens. And when that happens, then it's not responding quite as well. It's not protecting you quite as well. This is one of the reasons it's harder to vaccinate older people. And it's easier sometimes. That's why some people are more prone to disease or more prone to viruses when they're older. right? So this aging of the immune system, we believe strongly, is one of the things that make us more predisposed to things like age-related disorders like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. And you all know that age is the #1 risk factor for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So one of the things that neuroscientists and clinicians have not considered up until very recently, and by that I mean the last 10 years, is aging of the immune system. And so that is an area that my lab studies, and it needs to be studied more. So now that we know that the brain is in communication with the immune system, which is outside the brain mostly, there are immune cells going in and out of the brain that we now know for sure are going in and out. We don't know why, but we know that they go in and out. Sometimes they probably shouldn't be going in and out. And in diseases like multiple sclerosis, they go in and out a lot. We know that there's immune cells and bacteria in your gut that are important, and they should be there. And some of them are sending signals to the brain. They're making substances shown here in these boxes. And there's three-way communication. So this is a really important triad, and we are just now starting to understand it. So the role of the gut microbes has only been, understood maybe for the last 10 years. And there's trillions of bacteria that live in your gut, and many of them, if you don't have them, you can't absorb the food you eat. And so they're good bacteria. Many of them are there to keep you healthy. So what is the microbiome? The microbiome are basically bacteria and fungi and a whole bunch of things. But for today's discussion, we're going to talk a little bit mostly about the bacteria. But microbiome is composed of, a lot of different things, and it's in all the places that is in contact with the exterior world. There's microbiome in your mouth. There's microbiome in your stomach. There's microbiome in your gut or your intestines. There's microbiome in your urogenital tract. There's microbiome in your skin, right? Most of the excitement and attention is placed on your gut microbiome. So when people say, oh, the microbiome, they're more than likely talking about your gut microbiome. But the microbiome is everywhere. So when they talk about the gut microbiome, what are they talking about? So they're talking about the bacteria that is sitting on the lumen, or basically the lining of your gut. And the lining of your gut is kind of a complex demilitarized zone. And it's here, and it's a barrier, right? It's a barrier that is sitting with a lot of good bacteria, trying to keep out the bad bacteria. And it's got these really specialized cells that are like soldiers, and they're really held tight together to not allow stuff that shouldn't be going in. And right below it is this area called the lamina propria, and it's got immune cells sitting right here, so that if any pathogenic bacteria come in, they attack it and destroy it. Or if any pesticides or chemicals or anything that shouldn't be coming in, they detect it and destroy it. Okay. Now, when you have a food allergy or when you have some other allergic reaction, it's because some of these immune cells become confused and attack stuff that they shouldn't be attacking, right? So that's what an allergy might do. And so, what happens when you get like a bad burrito or, some contaminant like, listeria or something from contaminated food? These things get super leaky, and then water comes in there, and, you basically get a lot of leakiness, and now you don't absorb the nutrients, and now you've got diarrhea, right? So the tight junctions here in the absorption and what goes on here, it basically is dictating how well you're absorbing your food, what you send out, and everything that's going on here. Okay, so this is an important demilitarized zone that's super complex, and the balance of bacteria in this area, the diversity of bacteria in this area, it is going to keep you healthy, or it's going to give you a lot of trouble. And we really don't understand what the balance is. We know because we can sequence the DNA of some of these bacteria. We know, well, some of this is up, some of this is down in this disease, that disease. Don't let anybody really convince you that we know what that means. We really don't know what it means. We know a lot of stuff is up, a lot of stuff is down, but we don't really know if it's up or down, if it's bad, right? We if something's up in Parkinson's, maybe it's up because it's trying to counteract something else, right? So we really don't know yet. And we won't know until people do the right experiments to increase it or decrease it in an animal model and see what happens, to the brain and to other things. So it is still very early days, and I would be very careful if somebody says to you, take this, take that, it's going to cure your Parkinson's. There is no scientific evidence to support that idea. There is some scientific evidence to say that some probiotics and things can change the inflammation in your gut. Some probiotics can change the balance of bacteria in your gut. That is fine. But there is no scientific evidence that any probiotic in any disease can change anything in your brain. So just, be aware of that. Okay, where does it come from? The microbiome, basically, if you are a fetus, you're inside your mother, and the bacteria is acquired during birth. It's acquired during the passage through the urogenital canal, right? And the composition is variable, and then it's acquired through a person's life. It's acquired through the diet, it's acquired through your genetics, it's acquired through your environment, right? And this is why if you have a C-section, people are kind of encouraged to still, rub the baby with, the mother's urogenital secretions, because that's how you acquire the bacteria from the mother. If you don't go through the urogenital canal, you're not going to acquire the microbiome from the mother. And as the baby grows, it acquires its own bacteria from being handled and, from the stuff that it eats. And so that's how you acquire it. Most bacteria in the microbiota benefits you. It aids in digestion and wound healing. It regulates your immune system, obviously. But again, you can eat yogurt, Activia, this kind of stuff. That's great. You can buy the probiotics, like I buy the 50+ stuff at CVS, cheap stuff off the shelf. Makes me feel good, makes me regular. That's awesome. Some people buy the super fancy stuff you have to put in the refrigerator. I find that kind of inconvenient, but whatever makes you feel good. Again, there's no scientific evidence that any of it changes your disease. So just be aware. Antibiotics do save lives, but they destroy your microbiota, right? So we went through a stage where doctors overprescribed antibiotics, and they definitely overprescribed them when my kids were little. Ear infection, antibiotics, such and such, antibiotics, this and that, antibiotics. Every time you take antibiotics, you wipe out your microbiome in the gut. It does bounce back as soon as you start eating, but it is exactly what you're doing. So what happens sometimes when you do that is that a different species takes over, right? You leave an empty space in that ecosystem for something else to take over. So chronic use of antibiotics can potentially be bad because you get colonized by some crazy pathogenic bacteria. And one of the things that happens sometimes is you get this C. difficile colonization that you've heard about, and this is a life-threatening bacteria, right? And so you've probably heard about people that get C. difficile infections have to have what? A fecal microbiota transplant. And it's nothing other than they go in the ER, they get a fecal transplant from somebody else, usually a family member, and they just basically sit there until the thing incubates in place, and it is a life-saving procedure. If you don't have it, you will die. And so, they're doing this. Now, there are companies now that are making this a treatment, and they're packaging it, to cure your this, to cure your that, to cure your autism, to make you feel better, to cure your Parkinson's. I'm not aware of any scientific study that suggests or supports that is going to change your disease. So again, you need to be very careful, because I don't think the studies have been definitively done. There is definitely some very compelling and interesting looking, promising studies in mice that suggest that your microbiota, or the microbiota from one mice to another, can change the way that synuclein, potentially propagates and what things look like in the brain. But all of those studies, and we're doing some of them, they're very early days. And just because it happens in a mouse doesn't mean it happens in humans. So I think we've got a lot more to learn. Okay, which of these diseases do you think the microbiome has been demonstrated to play a role in? Anybody? One, two, more than three, a few? All of those. So a fair amount, right? And by play a role means that, some changes, some association, no direct causation, but it's been shown to maybe be dysfunctional, have some changes compared to people that don't have that disease. It's kind of compelling. And maybe, by changing the diet or changing the, probiotics or prebiotics, we might be able to affect it. Now, I mentioned synuclein. Why does it matter? Well, you all know about synuclein. You all know that we think it's the, triggering event for a lot of the problems in Parkinson's disease. And one of the potential places where that happens is potentially in the gut, right? And how does that happen? Well, we think that protein aggregation is the ill of a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases because it causes activation of microglial cells, inflammation. They become sort of hyperactivated, hyperinflamed, and they kill cells. But if you don't have protein aggregation because you have a mutation in these genes or a synuclein triplication, then how can you explain the microglial activation, right? Well, how do you explain sporadic disease, sporadic Parkinson's, sporadic Alzheimer's? So an interesting idea that we came up with, right? It's in the hypothesis, we don't know if it's right, is that what if people with sporadic disease could get protein aggregation and inflammation through other triggers? What if it's unhealthy aging and you get inflamed? What if it's chronic systemic disease like arthritis and other things? What if it's obesity or type 2 diabetes? Or what if it's peripheral infections or pesticide exposure or physical inactivity? Or pick 3 of your favorites, right? What if it's a dance card like cancer? What if you're this, and this, right? So it's a hypothesis, and the best we can do is try to test that in an animal model to say, well, when do you reach the threshold? How much of these do you need to actually get enough protein aggregation, enough inflammation, and where does it start to actually get you some kind of link between chronic inflammation inside the brain and then enough in the brain to give you pathology? So you all know that there's so many studies that have shown, there's inflammation in the Parkinsonian brain. After you look, at autopsy, there's, inflammation by histology. There's inflammation when you look in people's blood, but not everybody, right? So if we were to take all of us in here, even those of us that don't have Parkinson's, some of us will have inflammation in the blood, and we don't have Parkinson's. Some of you who do will have inflammation, but not all of you will. So that's the problem. There's a huge overlap between control and Parkinson's, and not all of it is directly related to disease. So how do we tell, right? So that's the problem. If we were to have PET imaging, some of us might have inflammation, some of you might, but not all of us will. So it's not really a definitive biomarker for Parkinson's. And then the genetics, right? There are some genes that may be overrepresented in a Parkinson's group that are not in a control group, but nothing to take home to the bank. So genetically, there's not a lot of information that tell us that genetically there's, a predisposition. Now, what about epidemiology? Is there anything study that suggests that inflammation or lack of inflammation changes your risk for Parkinson's? So that's a little bit more interesting. And again, you don't want to imply causation, but one of the things that we do see is that chronic non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen have been studied for many years, and there's an interesting association that suggests, and doesn't definitively prove, but it suggests that ibuprofen consumption over many, many, many years, like in your 30s or 40s, is associated with a maybe 50% decreased incidence of both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but only if it was consumed like in your 30s and 40s, right? If it was consumed later, like your 50s and 60s, there's no association. So that to me suggests that maybe the timing at which you reduced inflammation may be really important, right? So maybe if you consumed it chronically for like tennis elbow or things, that may be protective or may lower your risk, but maybe if you consumed it a lot, like before, like a hip replacement or something much later in life, then it's not as, quote, protective. That's my interpretation. And again, not all the studies that look at NSAID consumption suggest that. And there's no relationship with aspirin. Now, inflammatory bowel disease, that's an interesting one. And that gets us to the gut hypothesis for gut-brain. So you all know the non-motor symptoms. I don't need to tell you about it, but gut dysfunction is one of the things that makes people think, hey, could Parkinson's start in the gut? Maybe, maybe not. So if Parkinson's were to start in the gut, then can we see that there's gut inflammation? Is there something to it? So my lab did a study that we published in 2018 where we did see that intestinal inflammation was increased in Parkinson's patients compared to their spouses. So that was interesting. We saw a protein called calprotectin that was increased, and others reported it as well. And we saw that in the stool, we saw increased cytokines compared to the spouses. And so we thought, well, this is interesting because it means that the host, right, not just the microbes are changed, but the host, the person themselves is more inflamed. So we started to believe it. And then in the same paper, we saw that, there was increased anxiety twice as much in the Parkinson's patients versus their spouses. There was, increased incidence of reported depression. There was more sleep issues. There was more digestive problems. There was medication for digestive problems in the past 3 months. And there was, interestingly enough, twice the incidence of known or suspected inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's, or inflammatory bowel syndrome, or Crohn's and colitis, right? And that was kind of shocking to me because I kept asking my neurologist friends, do your patients report like digestive issues? And they were like, no. And I was like, do you ask them? And they're like, no. So I think that for a long time, neurologists were not asking their patients about their digestive issues, and patients were not reporting their digestive issues. Why would you, right? You're at the neurologist. You're not going to talk about your digestive issues. You're just talking about your brain or motor issues. And so now that we ask, we are actually finding a lot of IBD, IBS, digestive issues, not just constipation, but other things. So this is from a review where we suggest or propose that, this Braak hypothesis, Braak highway from the gut to the brain may really be, a thing that we need to pay attention to and investigate more, and that it may give us some additional clues about inflammation and this connection and communication between the gut, the microbiome, and the brain. So does Parkinson's begin in the gut? Well, we do see that patients with inflammatory bowel disease and Crohn's have an increased risk for developing Parkinson's. And that was something that the Crohn's and colitis community had not really appreciated until recently. The other thing that's really interesting to me, because I've been studying TNF for a long time, my lab started studying TNF when I started studying inflammation, because that's what I studied in biotech, is that there's a small study, and it hasn't been replicated. There's a small study suggesting that those patients with inflammatory bowel disease, many of which are on anti-TNF therapy, those that are on anti-TNF therapy and have IBD, those have a 78% reduction in their incidence of PD, right? So if you have IBD, you have increased incidence of PD unless you're on an anti-TNF, anti-inflammatory drug. So that's interesting, right? Because it does suggest some kind of association between inflammation, IBD, and then the anti-inflammatory therapy lowering that incidence. So that's basically our hypothesis, that some kind of intestinal inflammation, maybe through colitis, maybe through this regulation of your microbiome, maybe infection, maybe something else, could potentially dysregulate the inflammatory milieu in the gut through many different ways for different people, and create enough inflammation to potentially cause that synuclein in the gut to aggregate, and then possibly to propagate, that's the hypothesis for Brock, right? From the intestinal enteroendocrine cells through the enteric ganglia, up through the vagus, and up into the brain. If that doesn't happen, then the inflammation that's created could by itself create enough systemic inflammation in the blood to just create enough inflammation to make the blood-brain barrier, which is another barrier, a little leakier, to then allow cells, immune cells from the blood to enter your brain and then cause more inflammation directly, right? So two different options to create peripheral chronic inflammation in your gut or your blood affect your brain. And this is another cartoon just to show the same thing, that what's happening in the gut through the changes in your microbiome or changes in the gut itself through microbiome and inflammation could affect the expression of synuclein in the nerves and in these cells that I explained to you were lining the gut lumen. The microbes could be the trigger that make that enteroendocrine cell increase its expression of synuclein, and this has been shown, in the laboratory and in animals. And then there's this direct connection, basically, which then potentially anatomically is linked to the vagus and then up into the central nervous system. So the highway exists, right? The anatomical connection exists. We just don't know to what extent this idea that the microbes and the toxins could be the trigger that caused this to exist and then to happen, right? We don't really know if that's happening. So this is my last slide, I think. This just shows, this is from a diagram of a really smart man from Cork, Ireland. John Cryan is his name. He's one of my heroes. He studies the gut microbiome in all diseases, particularly anxiety, depression, and autism. And his idea is that the intestine is super important for regulating what actually comes out of your bone marrow, right? And he basically has some studies showing that if you mess with the microbes in the gut, you are actually upsetting the way that the immune cells are actually born out of your bone marrow, because immune cells are born out of your bone marrow every day, right? And then they come into your circulation and then they bathe your whole body, right? They oxygenate your body and they keep your immune system healthy. And so when you mess with the intestinal microbiota, you're reprogramming these cells that are coming out of your bone marrow, and they're going to affect your brain, you're going to affect all your tissues. And so he's basically saying that this is a big deal, right? These inhabitants of our gut, trillions of them that we didn't even know about until 10 years ago, are actually in charge. And what he's suggesting is that if we study them and we learn how to coexist with them and maybe how to regulate them and not upset them, that we might be able to identify ways to use them to treat all of these diseases. And he's talking about, chronic stress, traumatic brain injury, MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, stroke, and to try to figure out how to mitigate or prevent all of these diseases that are really affected by some of the immune cells that are coming out of your bone marrow. So back to the triad that I started out with, we have this very interesting relationship, right, between the brain, the blood immune system, which gets old with you, and then the gut microbiota, which is mostly your friend, but needs to be in good balance to keep you healthy. It's talking to your brain, it's talking to your immune cells, and the three of them need to be in balance to keep you healthy. And the goal of my lab and others that are in this field is to try to understand how these substances that are coming out of these organs could be leveraged to develop new therapies, or to maybe increase some of them or decrease some of them, or put some of them in a bottle so that you can rejuvenate, if you will, the immune system to an earlier stage, not to inhibit it, not to immunosuppress it, not to have an anti-inflammatory therapy, if you will, but to kind of reboot it or reset it to a more healthy and more sort of balanced state. And I'll take any questions.
That's amazing. So thank you so much, Malú. That was really clear and really great overview. Maybe you can stop sharing so we can see your lovely face there.
Yes, I'll start.
And there are kind of a lot of questions kind of all over the place. I'm just going to try to kind of, and I'll man the chat, so don't worry about it. You can just kind of focus on sort of what I'm asking you. But so it sounds like sort of from the concept of the immune system from the developing, baby, let's say, comes out of the womb. So you're sort of maybe advocating for, if possible, vaginal sort of secretions or vaginal delivery, and then possibly, some breastfeeding to get some immune stuff, and then not using, letting kids play in their environment, not, sterilizing everything.
Eat the dirt.
Eat the dirt, exactly, like many of us did when we were little. And then trying to avoid antibiotics for every little thing, trying to eat, I guess, healthy, but not necessarily thinking that probiotics are going to help anything with our current knowledge, the sort of, the expensive ones with live cultures and things, not really great evidence for that. Possibly there's a sense that if you have inflammatory diseases, just sort of through the chat, people have asked things like rheumatoid arthritis, pancreatitis, things that might, cause inflammation, that might maybe a little bit of something that puts you at an increased risk for getting things like the inflammatory bowel disease is something that's kind of coming out right now. But, things that, disease processes that might be inflammatory may sort of be part of the triggers. But then if you maybe earlier in life, in your 30s, 40s, use anti-inflammatory drugs, there may be a little bit of a less risk. But so then fast forwarding to when people get, diagnosed with Parkinson's and you're now sort of treating the disease. Currently, I think, patients, get quite, in the weeds about some of these things and, oh, I should have done this 20 years ago, or maybe something I did 30 years ago may have made a difference. I think, what I'm hoping to really bring to our patients is sort of practical, what can we do now to really change things if possible, given our current, read of the science, which, as you've already mentioned, is kind of, there's a lot of type of different things every day. And, today it's, take this yogurt that might change your life. And then tomorrow it's, get a fecal transplant for Parkinson's. So I think currently, let's say you just got diagnosed with Parkinson's and you, you're trying to live the best sort of lifestyle you can. What are your thoughts sort of on practical things that our patients, in terms of, for example, I think things that have been mentioned include constipation strategies that they might be on. Is that affecting their gut? Are there, immune, like PPIs, like the pepsid, the proton inhibitor things that affect acid reduction. Do you have a sense that affects it? There's a few other sorts of things that have been asked, whether they may affect things. So maybe you could just kind of give us a sense from your understanding right now? What can we do kind of for a patient today?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what I would say is the best anti-inflammatory is exercise, right? Indeed. I mean, we did not know that even 5 years ago. I remember being at the WPC meeting in Glasgow in 2010. And the first mention of that was like, what? Really? Tango? What are you talking about? And now it is, I mean, you needed to have been exercising, you know, obviously when you were a kid, but there's studies that said really are convincing that that it can slow things down, and it may be the best thing you can do. Absolutely. So if I got a Parkinson's diagnosis today, that would be the one thing I would absolutely positively put on my list. 20 minutes every day, break a sweat. And it is very different for every person. So you know, what you do is what makes you break a sweat, right? 20 minutes minimum. And then eat a healthy diet. And I would say that eating a healthy diet, you know, that is low in, you know, sugars. Sugars are the worst. From our animal studies, sugars are the worst and much worse than fats, right? Fructose, which is, you know, the super refined sugars, are the worst for causing inflammation and in the gut. And so a lot of people say, you know, the Mediterranean diets, you know, that have like some fiber, they're not totally carb free, but they have some fiber and, you know, some fat, but they're and some protein or whatever. It's whatever your body can do, and more importantly, it's whatever you can maintain. It has to be sustainable, right? You cannot do something that you can stay on for a week. And I think that is the key. And so if I had to do two things, it would be exercise and good diet. And the probiotics, if they make you feel good and they keep you regular and you feel good, I would by all means do them. And then of course talk to your doctor about other things that may help you keep good GI health. That's really about it. I think that we don't know really how other interventions affect, you know, everything affects the microbiome. We know that medications interact with it. All the microbiome studies in the world that are published out there, and we are in the middle of publishing one that's a replication of the one that I showed you with a neurologist in Finland. And people look very similar the world round, regardless of what they're eating. So, you know, I think medications interact, and we can't. It's hard to disentangle. But I would say that the good news is that things that you can do within your reach, like exercise and a healthy diet, are probably the two most powerful things, much more powerful than medications.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I think it's good to make it simple. You know, I think we see all this data, and then that people get overwhelmed. They're like, should I be, you know, doing this or that? So I think that's really great to hear from somebody like you who really, you know, can digest this.
And I believe in it. I believe in it because I've been doing it. The other thing that I would say, if I could add a third thing, I would say some meditation and relaxation, like really, you know, just good for the soul, right? Just especially in these days.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you that because, you know, as you know, I have a yoga and mindfulness teaching kind of.
Yes, and I almost forgot that. I did not say that to plug that, but yes.
You always think I like pay them off like when they come on here, but I
was going to say, no, I totally forgot about that. Yes.
Yeah, but I do think that, you know, I go to a lot of meetings and have been on integrative medicine, and some of this is, you know, stuff that people have been talking about in that sphere of, like, you know, leaky gut and healthy microbiome, and sort of not using too many medications for infections, and just trying to live like lifestyle sort of oriented approaches, which I think, you know, people have been talking about that. We've spent so much time in the Western field talking about this pill and that surgery, but I do think that some of this stuff is really not well counseled puzzled about. And I think it's so important. And when you look at those sort of, the triangular things and even these sort of, the factors that are affected in the blood and stuff, and in the gut, and you look even at things like anxiety, as you mentioned in these patients, there is sort of a sense that anxiety itself can worsen some of the inflammation. And this feedback so if you can break the cycle somewhere, and I think we're trying to figure out how to break these cycles in the safest way possible. So if you can control anxiety through exercise and meditation and not have, inflammation going up and down with like eating crap all day and getting a good night's sleep and trying to sort of set whatever you can as a pathway to then being able to use medication to try to sustain that, with a good Parkinson's doc. I think that, what we're resoundingly hearing on this series, and I don't know if it's just because I'm hosting, I don't really know, but, is these basic things. So I do think that we kind of have to get back to basics. And I think it doesn't hurt to hear it from everybody, especially in this COVID timeframe, because I think so many of us have been so stressed or worried about, this time frame and what's the future hold. And I think whatever we can do to break that cycle of stress and worry is also going to hopefully help people.
No, you're absolutely right. I have to tell you that, one of the reasons that the inflammation studies are so all over the place is that when you draw blood from someone, if they haven't had a good night's sleep the night before, they're going to be inflamed. If they're stressed, they're going to be inflamed. How I put the tourniquet on your arm is going to determine how your cytokines come out. So the inflammation in your body is totally responsive to your state of mind and your stress. In fact, it's really interesting how the amount of interleukin-6 in your body actually is directly correlated with how fast you walk. And so if you look at someone walking down the street and they're walking super slowly and kind of like achy and kind of, they almost always have super high IL-6, and sort of like the fast walkers are like super low IL-6. So, it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I would say stress and, hurriedness is the worst thing you can do for inflammation in your body.
Well, that's fascinating. And it's I think for caregivers too, a lot of this is important, because I think that a lot of, our caregivers are under some of the stress, and also, not sleeping and, all these sorts of things. So I think it, just sort of the all these approaches for everyone in your household and your dog.
So in our study, when we did the inflammation study, and people always compare Parkinson's and a control, and almost always the control is not a Parkinson's subject, but is someone not in the home, right? And so we said, no, it has to be the caregiver. It has to be someone in the home, because we're comparing stool, and it's like they have to be in the same environment, right? And it turns out that the inflammation in the household control, non-Parkinson's, spouse, is intermediate between a Parkinson's patient and a control that doesn't live in the house. And we're like, why is the spouse inflamed? And everybody's like, have you ever been a caregiver? So it was like, oh yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this has been amazing. We have a few more minutes, and I wanted to ask you some slightly more controversial questions. And that we've had Ben Stecher on here and Alberto Espe, who I know you're close to as well. I see everyone, even though we all kind of fight it out sometimes, we're all very close, in social media and in person too. So what's your sense of the Brain Fables kind of story, and kind of where you sort of see your hypothesis fitting in? And I know, people are quite open-minded, but, still working on these theories. So maybe you could tell us kind of what your sense of their theory is, and how you've, your hypothesis fits in there.
Well, so I'm familiar with, Alberto's issues as to how we have really thought of Parkinson's in the wrong way, right? That we've lumped everything, and we've been studying Parkinson's disease instead of people with Parkinson's, and that we need to not be looking to the ashes in the fire, right? And I completely agree with him. I think that genetics and what we've learned from the genetic cases have been super helpful in understanding the underlying mechanisms. But I am convinced that he is right. We need to study people with Parkinson's rather than Parkinson's disease. I am now convinced that Parkinson's disease is many diseases. It is not one. And I think, Alzheimer's disease is also many diseases. And actually that's already being kind of admitted and acknowledged. I think it's easier for the one size fits all approach. But as soon as you start looking at the heterogeneity with all these technologies that we have, it's clear that we are not going to get anywhere that way. And so the way that you need to do it is you need to embrace the heterogeneity. And funny enough, when we start doing animal models and the heterogeneity came out in the mice, people said, well, these mice are too heterogeneous. They're not a good model for the people because the people are so homogeneous. We're like, no, they're not. The mice are doing exactly what the people are doing. Yeah. You guys don't want to admit that the people are heterogeneous too. And so it's biology. We realize that the mice are just as heterogeneous as the people. So I think it's biology, right? You have to have in a naturally selected population, if everybody's homogeneous, nobody's going to be left standing. So I really think that in any disease, you have natural selection and you have advantage and disadvantage. And to me, the way I think of all these diseases, it's a gene by environment interaction. And even the cases where people say, oh, it's not genetic, oh, it's this, everything has a gene environment interaction. And it's not genetic until you find the genetic predisposition, right? And so even for the genetic cases, there's 50% penetrance. What does that tell you? That penetrance is being, dialed up by the environmental triggers that person experiences. So that to me is a glass half full, right? You're born with a certain set of genes that you cannot change just yet. But the other half, you can totally determine by the exposures that you submit yourself to, the exercise, the diet, whether you live in a polluted city or not, whether you drink or not, whether you smoke or not. And we were talking about smoking actually earlier. When we look at smoking effects on the microbiome, they're profound. And interestingly enough, in the study that we did, the people that had smoked and stopped smoking, the changes on the microbiome were long lasting. So my theory is that some of the protective effects that people see on smoking and Parkinson's may actually be mediated through microbiome changes. I don't know what they are, but I suspect that some of those long-lasting changes may be related to some protective effect. And I'm not saying go out and smoke. I'm just saying that may be one potential way to explain them, and somebody needs to look at it. But I just think that it's good news that, to me, that you have a lot of ways to manipulate the other 50% of that gene by environment interaction, and even genetic cases are very modulatable. So in my way of thinking, Alberto's right that we need to study people with Parkinson's, and every exception to the rule should be, informative and paid attention to.
Absolutely. Wow. What a great summary of everything. So Malú, we're almost out of time, and I just wanted to give you the last minute to, send us into, the rest of our day, the rest of our month, the rest of the holiday season with some hope from your knowledge of the whole of science and the fields of PE, because you do keep, I noticed that you are have your your finger on the pulse of what's going on out there in the Parkinson's science world. So tell us, from your perspective, what you want to tell us about that.
Well, I would say that, Parkinson's has always been thought of as the redheaded stepchild of the neurodegenerative diseases, right? We get less money, we are less well known. Alzheimer's gets all the money, all the attention, but there is an advantage to going second, right? They're going first, and we are learning the lessons that the Alzheimer's field has gone through, and I think we are learning what not to do for the things that they've done. And so my lab works on both diseases, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And believe me, we are comparing and contrasting, and we are going to try to avoid some of the mistakes that have been done. And I call them mistakes only because you learn from the stuff that doesn't work and you learn a lot from the failures. And so in terms of biomarkers, we know exactly what to look for and what to try to avoid. And so I would say there's a lot of hope, because there's a bigger disease out there that's leveraging a lot of attention and a lot of attention to inflammation. And in the neurodegeneration meeting that's going on right now, people actually said this morning in the keynote lecture, it's important to compare to Parkinson's and to frontotemporal dementia, because in the comparison, we will really learn about all the diseases. So, when we lift everybody, the whole boat, everybody floats.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the work that you do and your commitment, and we really appreciate you coming on here. And if they'll send you the comments, the Sarah and her gang, but
I would love to see all the comments.
A lot of love out there for you and this type of talk. So we'll have to have you back because you made it so clear. I understood it all. So I really appreciate that. But thank you for spending the time, Malú. We so appreciate it. And Sarah, I'll send it back to you for our goodbye wave.
Okay, thank you so much. This was amazing. I agree. We could do a whole nother hour on this. There's a lot of questions.
I would be happy to come back anytime. And yes, I do get funding from the Michael J. Fox Foundation. Thanks to them and to the Parkinson's Foundation as well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here. And let's give a wave and gratitude for such a great program. You can access the recording online. It'll be there within the next day or so. And thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye, guys.